On our program this week, horticultural plants, landscaping, and greenhouse production. The rose has fascinated all people. The Greeks associated it with the worship of Venus. The Romans went so far as to eat it. During the 15th century, a struggle for the throne between two English families whose badges were two different colored roses was even named after it, the War of the Roses. Modern-day horticulturists are also waging a battle, but with cuttings and crossings. By mastering the laws of plant sexuality and genetics, horticulturists have managed to create plant works of art. They also had to learn how to propagate their new varieties. Seed sowing is one of the most common methods used to reproduce plants. Seed is the result of sexual reproduction in plants. That is, the union of the pollen produced by the stamina and the ovules concealed in the pistil. However, as in humans, the descendants of sexual reproduction between two individuals are often different from one another. To obtain identical copies of a plant in large numbers, horticulturists use asexual reproduction, or vegetative propagation. This reproduction method, specific to plants, produces clones, perfect replicas of the parent plant. For example, many ornamental plants can be propagated by cuttings, a simple procedure. First, a small leafy branch of the plant is cut just above the node, and the lower leaves removed. The end of the cutting is then dipped into a hormone solution, or powder. The hormones, called auxins, are chemical messengers that promote root development. The cutting is finally planted in a sterile mixture away from direct sunlight. Under the influence of the auxin hormones, the cells of the cutting or branch planted in the soil begin to divide, producing root cells, which in turn form radicals. Propagation by cuttings is enhanced by a warm culture medium. However, until the roots have formed, the leaves must be kept cool and vaporized with water to prevent them from drying out. After a few weeks, the root is sufficiently developed to nourish the cutting and feed it water. It can then be transplanted outside. When propagation by cuttings proves difficult, horticulturists can employ another method, grafting. This technique consists of fusing the upper part of the plant to be propagated to the base of another plant. This other plant becomes the rootstock, and the upper part, the scion. The rootstock provides the scion with the water and minerals it needs to grow. In exchange, the scion provides the rootstock with the sugars it produces by photosynthesis. There is a broad range of grafts. Shield of tea budding, for example, is used to propagate rose bushes. In August, a shield bud is cut from the rose bush to be propagated. The scion is inserted where a T-shaped incision has been made in the bark of another rose bush that acts as a stalk. It is then spliced. This puts living tissue called cambiums into contact. The cambiums will soon form new sap-conducting tissue. The new tissue will unite the scion to the stalk. The following spring, the scion will have produced leaves, and the elevated portion of the rootstock can be cut. From From a single donor rosebush, anywhere from 10 to 40 new plants can be produced. They will produce the same flowers as the donor rosebush. However, the rootstock will give these flowers certain traits, such as greater resistance to cold temperatures and disease. These plant propagation techniques have been practiced for centuries. Recently, a new, more effective approach has been developed: in vitro propagation. With this method, thousands of identical plants can be obtained in record time from tiny fragments, even from just a few of the parent plant cells. First, a minute segment is taken from the plant to be propagated. It can be, for instance, a meristem, that is a group of rapidly dividing cells, or a bud located at the axil of a leaf. The segment, termed an explant, is then cultivated in a sterile medium containing minerals, sugars, and plant hormones. Here, the cells of the explant rapidly multiply, forming a tuft of young shoots and buds. These can be divided and reproduced in other test tubes, where they will form new shoots, and so on. After the propagation stage, the shoots are transferred into a different culture medium, which promotes the development of roots. In vitro propagation has considerable potential. In just a few months, up to 1 million clones can be produced from a single parent plant. In addition, the plants produced by this method are free of virus diseases. Test tube plants bear the seeds of a veritable horticultural revolution. From the very beginnings of civilization, the Oriental were past masters in the art of gardens. That art would only develop in the Western world much later, beginning for the most part with the vegetable gardens of monasteries. Westerners then discovered the garden's aesthetic and social values. As for modern landscaping, the applications are very down to earth. In spite of their diversity, human civilizations all share a common need: to harness nature and reproduce their own version of it. This is how the garden was born, a place where our concepts of beauty and harmony are brought to life. Throughout history, every society has imagined an ideal garden, reflecting its view of nature. For example, in the West, the ordinary garden, known as the French garden, imposes its symmetry on a domesticated nature. It is a rigorously arranged whole that obeys the laws of geometry and perspective. Conversely, the English garden extolled the virtues of a natural, wild landscape. For their part, Oriental gardens attempt to impart a feeling of harmony, conducive to meditation and the contemplation of nature. The landscape architect draws his inspiration from such artistic leanings, but he must also respect the biological laws that determine plant survival and growth. For example, today's public places and city parks are often located in areas not particularly suitable for plant development. The development plan and choice of plants will therefore depend on the physical limitations imposed by the site. For instance, shade cast by buildings can impede the growth of certain species but boost others. All plants grow through photosynthesis. During this biochemical process, the chlorophyll in plant cells traps the sunlight, From water and carbon dioxide, the plant produces the nutritive substances it needs to grow. Shade plants manage to achieve photosynthesis with much less light than sun plants. This tolerance for shade can be explained several ways. First, shade plant cells contain more chlorophyll. Second, their leaves are often larger and more abundant than those of sun plants. On the other hand, sun plants have a distinct advantage when in direct sunlight, achieving higher photosynthesis and growth rates than their shade counterparts. The landscaper must therefore carefully evaluate his site and its shady areas so as to select the plants most likely to prosper. His choices must also take into account the type of soil, the strength and direction of the winds, as well as the utilization of the site that can be affected, for instance, by levels of pedestrian traffic. Landscape design must also respect another fundamental principle. Unlike the structure of a building, that of a garden changes constantly over time. The landscape architect, therefore, has to be able to anticipate how his garden will grow, as it were, to make sure his composition will be just as attractive 10 or 20 years down the road. Fortunately, each plant species has its own growth pattern, which, because very stable, is very predictable. By studying the disposition of the leaves and branches and the growth patterns of a number of plant species, researchers have even managed to predict their development by computer program. The computer program enables them to trace a tree's growth in seconds and to predict the space it will occupy in 10 or 20 years. This technique can be used, for example, to visualize how a villa landscape will evolve over time, or to determine the best location for a city park. Nowadays, however, landscape architecture is not confined solely to designing ornamental parks and gardens. It can have very concrete applications. The object may be to limit the growth of a given natural vegetation to a predetermined height. Ecologists have, for instance, developed a landscaping technique that could facilitate vegetation maintenance in hydroline passageways. As a rule, the forest takes over these cleared land areas. The trees, which constitute a threat to power lines, must then be felled. But the researchers have come up with an alternative, which consists of greatly slowing down the plant succession process. A thick grove of natural shrubbery will do the trick and prevent trees from growing. This is done by propagating shrubs by a technique termed layering. Vigorous branches are pulled down to the ground, but not cut. At the level of a node, they are covered in soil. In time, the branch will root and form a new shrub. Little by little, an impenetrable grove of shrubs takes over the site. It is believed that such a wild garden could survive with a minimum of care for dozens of years. Increasingly, the art of landscaping is spilling out into other new areas. Modern landscape architects, now engineering freeway and major pedestrian mall landscapes, are a far cry indeed from their original, purely decorative calling. Flowers and fruits are now available year-round. Forcing plants to flower during the winter months may seem to go against nature. However, thanks to greenhouse production, it's become child's play. In many parts of the world, the climate prevents plants from being grown outside all year round. Still, a great variety of fresh vegetables, flowers, and tropical plants are available in these places, even in the dead of winter. This defiance of nature is possible thanks to an old and ingenious invention, the greenhouse. These artificial ecosystems extend the growing season of most commercial plants, so they can be cultivated year-round, sometimes on a very large scale. Of the many factors that influence plant life, temperature plays a key role. A greenhouse's main function is therefore to maintain a suitable temperature. This is done in part by a phenomenon known as the greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect is explained by the selective transparency of glass to infrared radiation. Infrared rays are part of the spectrum of radiation emitted by the sun. Infrared rays are invisible, but they constitute heat conductors. Depending on their wavelength, two types can be distinguished: low infrared and high infrared. On Earth, the sun's heat reaches us mainly in the form of low infrared. These rays go through the glass walls of the greenhouse to the soil and plants, which absorb them and warm up. However, soil and plants tend to lose some of their heat in the form of another radiation, high infrared. Glass is not transparent to high infrared. This therefore does not pass back through the greenhouse walls, but is reflected down towards the soil and vegetation, which absorbs it again. This is how the heat stays trapped inside the greenhouse. Thanks to the greenhouse effect, heating systems can be kept at the bare minimum during the day. It is even often necessary to refresh the greenhouse by opening some outside panels, using fans or spraying water. Artificial heating is, however, essential to maintain sufficient heat at night and during the months when there is less solar radiation. Light is another factor vital to plant life. Its quality and intensity and the length of daylight illumination influence the yield, shape, and blooming of plants. To control the amount of light, greenhouses may be equipped with sunscreens that filter part of the sunlight during the day. Conversely, backup lighting is used to prolong the light's duration or to increase natural luminous intensity. Backup lighting has many applications. For example, researchers have noted that increasing the photo period increased the yields of certain vegetables. Other experiments have shown that turning the lights off for short periods during the day can promote blooming. The lamps are turned off for 45 seconds every hour. When they come back on for a few seconds, they let off a great deal of red light. Red light activates the phytochromes, the molecules that spur blooming. In the case of the geranium, this process helped reduce blooming time by 40% and multiplied the number of flowers by 5. In large greenhouse complexes, manual watering is being replaced by hydroponic culture. The plants are cultivated in a neutral environment where they are fed a mixture of water and nutrients drop by drop. In another process, the roots are put directly into the nutrient solution, which circulates continuously. An advantage of hydroponics is that it makes it possible to precisely regulate the amount of nutrients plants are fed. Moreover, the solution can be recycled and reused, which is both economical and ecological. A final factor plays an important role in plant growth, namely the concentration of carbon dioxide in the air. This gas is absorbed by plants during photosynthesis. In some greenhouses, carbon dioxide levels are increased. As a result, yields are substantially higher. However, monitoring these various factors simultaneously is a difficult task. Increasingly, computers are being given that job. Sensors located inside and outside the greenhouse constantly monitor temperature, humidity, sunlight, and carbon dioxide levels. According to a predetermined program, the computer manages the operation of all the devices while trying to keep costs down. For example, if the sun breaks through on a cloudy day, the lamps will go off. Greenhouse culture may have taken some of the romanticism out of gardening, but its effectiveness more than makes up for it. In spite of all their achievements, horticulturists still face many challenges. For instance, a sky blue rose has yet to be created. And we can only hope that when it finally is, people won't fight over who it rightfully belongs to.